The History Hour podcast is made possible with our partner WUPI 92.1 FM The Owl, Armpits and Presque Isle's #1 hit music station. Hello and welcome to another show of the History Hour podcast. I am your host, Evan Zarkadas, and with the help of my co-host, Kaleb, Pennell, we are bringing you another History Hour.
Hi, good to see you all.
On this episode, we will be talking about the presence of the Underground Railroad in Northern Maine. Now, it's time to welcome Dr. Lea Allen and Mr. Joe G to the History Hour podcast. Dr. Allen is an assistant professor of English at the University of Maine Presque Isle and the director of the honors program at the university. She received her bachelor's from the University of Maine Presque Isle in 2000 and her PhD from Brown University in 2008. Mr. Joe G is a director and founder of the Tomlinson Lake Hike to Freedom in New Brunswick, and he has been extremely active and involved in the history and preservation of local history of his area. Hello, Dr. Allen and Mr. G, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, Evan.
Hi.
Thank you for having us. Glad to be here.
Great.
Glad to hear it.
So I guess we'll begin this discussion and talk. Again, we said that we're going to be talking about the Underground Railroad, specifically in Northern Maine. But before we begin our conversation, Dr. Allen, could you tell us about your involvement with the study of the Underground Railroad here in Northern Maine, and how come that you've become interested in this topic?
I guess first, I had heard about the Friends Church in Port Fairfield with the pew, supposedly. The way I understood it was hidden under a pew. Turns out it's not quite under a pew, but I'd heard about the secret space. I was curious about that. And I actually, I guess even further back, one of my ancestors is Thomas Garrett, who was an abolitionist. And somewhere in the family library, there's supposedly a memoir, which we haven't located yet. But that kind of was a interest to me, and I'd like to get my hands on it if I can find it. And then I guess more recently, when the honors program was looking for a topic that we could do interdisciplinary study with a lot of different faculty perspectives involved, I thought that the Underground Railroad would be a great opportunity to have history professors. We wanted to have some of the biology involved in, what's involved in race, different myths of race. We wanted art professors involved and some of the artwork around it, or the idea of the quilts. We even had a math major who wanted to be involved somehow. So I was looking for a project, and I thought the Underground Railroads. And actually, I knew that Mr. G here had some knowledge that we could tap into, and I also was aware of a couple other people in the area. So we thought it might be a good project that would pull in a lot of different perspectives and would be something important to the area that I think not a lot of people know about.
Yeah, great. And Mr. G, will you give us a short description of your work in New Brunswick and the Hike to Freedom event that you host every year?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in local history or even New Brunswick and Maine history. And when I was younger, I heard about the Underground Railroad that came to Port Fairfield or Maple Grove, Maine, and how the Quakers helped the fugitive slaves to Canada through the woods and helped them reach Tomlinson Lake. I found that out through Art Mraz and his wife Ruth, who were both researchers or even historians that researched that local history of those Quakers that were conductors of that northernmost route of the Underground Railroad that came to Northern Maine. So I live right on the border, and a section of that trail that they would have taken, like from French Church to Tomlinson Lake, runs right across our family farm. And so 7 years ago, I met with Art Mraz. His wife Ruth had passed away but he was happy to share with me all the history that and all the work that they have researched over the years. And I explained to him what I wanted to do, which was basically hold an annual hiking event each year that kind of pays tribute to those who made that journey to New Brunswick through Aroostook County.
Great, thank you. So let us begin this conversation with giving a short description of what the Underground Railroad was and what is signified. According to Wikipedia, the Underground Railroad was a network of secret routes and safe houses established here in the United States during the early and mid-1800s. It was used by enslaved African Americans that wanted to escape the southern states and move to the northern free states in Canada with the help and guidance of various anti-slavery Americans. Of course, and we do get this question all the time, believe it or not, there was no actual railroad during this network and event.
It was a metaphor for the path.
So we really wanted to make that clear before we continue. The desirable destination was British North America, present-day Canada, and it's because of this long border that gave many points of access. It was further from slave catchers and beyond the reach of the United States Fugitive Slave Act. So most former slaves reaching Canada by boats, for example, across Lake Ontario, they settled in the area that they reached. More than 30,000 people were said to have escaped there via the network during this 20-year peak period, although the U.S. Census figures about only 6,000. Numerous fugitive stories are documented in the 1872 book The Underground Railroad Records by William Still, an abolitionist who then headed the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. And we started with this short explanation of what it is, and I have a map in front of me, and I'll kind of give a short explanation of what it looks like to our listeners. The Underground Railroad, as it's shown in most of the maps, shows that fugitive slaves escaped north from the southern states, so they will go through Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Great Lakes, all the way up north and escape through that. But you also have an offshoot that went through New York with a few branches that kept through the west side of New York. Then you have a few that went through Boston and went west as well. But you also, and that's what we're going to focus more today, is the east path that went through southern Maine. And to examine the relationship between the Underground Railroad and Northern Maine now, which is the main focus of our podcast today, we know there were places in southern Maine that are proven to have been part of the Underground Railroad. But the question is, why Northern Maine, and how did that even come up in the bigger image of that discussion? Well, I mean, will anyone choose the northernmost part of Maine to escape? And again, for those that are not from Maine that are listening to us today, Northern Maine is very, it's dense. It's
and especially in the winter, it's almost impassable at some parts.
It's a dense forestry. So it's really difficult, especially at that time with lesser roads, for anyone to be able to go up there. So that's one of the questions that we have. And we know that slaves got all the way to Bangor. And there is proof, I believe, of houses and meeting places of the Underground Railroad in Bangor. But the question, I guess, to our guest is, why will someone, after reaching Bangor, decide to travel north to what is, for example, Fort Fairfield and go across the New Brunswick border?
Yeah.
Well, I have several different points that come to my mind. Well, one is that's where the Quakers were. So you had abolitionists who were also conductors of the Underground Railroad that lived outside of Fort Fairfield and Maple Grove. So if it's like if you're going to go get a meal, you're going to go to, a restaurant, right? So if you want to escape being caught, like say you were afraid you're going to be caught by a bounty hunter and you needed help to get to Canada and you didn't know where you were going and you relied on the help of these conductors who were helping you escape, you're going to go to where they are. So whoever, let's say you're in Bangor and there was a threat of bounty hunters in, let's say, near St. Stephen or Calais. The conductors are like, what was the name of the house? It was the Holyoke House. Let's say John Holyoke, who owned a house in Brewer, Maine. He was also active in the Underground Railroad. So let's say he had a tip that there was a bounty hunter in Calais, Maine. Well, he's gonna send you to Fort Fairfield to cross, and if you was a bounty hunter, you might even think like, well, why would I go to Fort Fairfield, Maine? Because there's no way in heck anybody's going to travel to Fort Fairfield, Maine to escape when it's shorter just to go to Calais. So as Marilyn Roper and Harry Roper made the point, the shortest route wasn't always the safest. Sometimes the longest route was the safest route. So it makes sense that they would do that.
And I think you need to realize that there's a lot, and this is the time where there's a lot of maritime shipping still happening. So all along the coast, you've got very populated, shipping industries, and there's a lot of movement. I think if you read the literature, it's surprising the amount of people who are moving from place to place in the Maritimes, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, down into Maine, back up again, and it's surprising. I think we tend to think that far back, people don't travel around as much, but there is actually quite a bit of movement. And so there were a lot of, earlier there had been a lot of black settlements, communities, black sailors, black carpenters, shipbuilders.
So I guess what we're getting is that it was a busy area at that time, and you mentioned the maritime trade. So I guess we do understand that it was a safe route to go up north. Of course, we have to, I guess, understand that it must have been harder, but it was the safest place to go through. Because even if you go through the southern border and cross, then that's where the bounty hunters will probably be staged and wait for you to catch you. So I guess going up north was the safest option, although not the easiest.
Plus, you got to imagine, like, the bounty hunters are always going to assume what will be, like, they go for ports. They can take a ship directly into Canada or British North America at the time. So Aroostook County and up north would probably be the most unexpected route. It'd be a good, quote-unquote, strategic move to go to a place that not many would follow.
Because the Underground Railroad, if we know from our sources, was part of connections. This person knew somebody in the other town, they will send them to their friends, and it was, we know up here they were the Quakers, so it does make sense. And
that was one of the things that came out in our research, remember, was the Winthrop family that settles in the Mapleton Grove. They came from further south in the state of Maine and then moved up further north by, was it 1830s, I think, if I remember the dates correctly. So that they could have had connections as well.
Okay. So we do have some research, actually, and you mentioned, Mr. G, some of your previous researchers that you based your studies from. And so we do have some research on that, so it's factual at some point.
At the moment, the Abyssinian Meeting House in Portland, Maine, I think is the only site or station that's on the National Park Service Registry. But there are other sites that, there's kind of a whole list of qualifications you have to meet. And that's the only one where they know there was a newspaper being written out of there. We know there was a black preacher. We know he hit somebody in the house. So that's the only one that's on the National Park Register at the moment. But there's been a lot of research done on other sites to try to get them on as well. I mean, this gets into that tricky question that we looked at a lot this in our seminar, in the honors seminar, right? In terms of how do you corroborate the sort of oral history and what, there's a very strict, the National Park Service has a very strict, but then there are a lot of other stories that have come down. So I think there's 31 sites in Maine that are supposed to be. So far, only one's made it on. So it needs more research to get the other 31 sites on.
Yeah, well, how much research is enough research, though? Who gauges that, really? That's one of the things about the Underground Railroad is if you want to become a historian or a real professional researcher, the history of the Underground Railroad is like boot camp. Because if you dive in you dive into the Underground Railroad and start studying that for 10 years, and then when you start to try to study other different types of history, like English loyalist history, it seems like a piece of cake afterwards. Because everything that we know, we're relying that on oral history, what's been handed down through talk, and we can make a lot of assumptions. But a lot of times, what you find out with the Underground Railroad is those stories that we hear that have been handed down through several generations always prove to be true. Which is the case with the Holyoke House, which was thought to it was just oral history until they tore the house down to improve that intersection. And when they tore the house down, they found the evidence there that there was actually black fugitives that had harbored there.
Okay.
And we can make it a lot of assumptions too. Like I think somebody made the assumption that going to Aroostook County was harder than would be going to Southern Maine, but we don't know that for sure because we're just basing that on distance. Now, if someone was in Bangor and they knew they could hitch a ride, someone like someone who could be trusted was hauling a wagon full of something up to Fort Fairfield, Maine. Well, they could get a ride on that wagon nonstop and not have to worry about making any multiple connections between Bangor and Robinson, Maine, for instance.
So there were not many connections between Bangor and Fort Fairfield. So there were not many developed like big towns at that time, correct?
Well, there was Holton.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was Holton, Maine.
There was a stop and brew.
And like I think I think back then maybe some of those towns were a lot bigger than the size that a lot of those same towns are today. Because I think it was like potato farming was booming. We had a lot of Canadians that were coming across the border to work in the woods, and it was kind of pre-Civil War era. There was a lot happening.
So okay, we do have some, and I want to touch upon more of the detail, because it's really important to understand and have a clear image of after Bangor then what. So we have them go to Fort Fairfield, where the station there was the Maple Grove Church. And I personally been to the church with Dr. Allen during the honors seminar here at the University of Maine, Presque Isle, and we saw the I don't want to call it the bunker, but that's that area where they used to hide them. And after that, I guess the family that owned the church, and please, you two, please jump in at any time. They will then take them and or direct them to cross the border until they find the Tomlinson Lake, and then that signified that they were in Canada, so that means they were free.
Well, I think there's another stop. You know that one.
Yeah.
Right?
So this is oral history again. And it hasn't been proven. However, we still share that story, and that's about the James Fitzherbert's Tavern and blacksmith shop. James Fitzherbert was from Andover, New Brunswick. Traveled up the Aroostook the Aroostook River. Sorry, I've got winter on my brain.
It's coming soon, so
forward to it. So he traveled up the Aroostook River and built a blacksmith shop and a tavern about half a kilometer away from where the border exists today. And the oral history dictates that he built a woodshed that had a secret room behind a sliding door, and he used that to hide British soldiers in it for different skirmishes that happened between Canada and the U.S. Early 1800s. But he later used that room to hide black fugitives in, and when the coast was clear, he would load them on a cart, or somebody would load them on a cart and cover them up with straw and take them up the Sam Everett Road until they came to the Lake Brook. and they would follow that brook to Tomlinson Lake.
Okay.
And at that time, there was also a road. There was a woods road that went from Beaconsfield through Tomlinson Lake, through Carlingford, all the way to the Pennell dock in Fort Fairfield, Maine. There was a wood sawmill there, and a lot of the guys that were cutting timbers and on the Canadian side of the border would haul their timbers to Fort Fairfield to be milled. And so I kind of speculated that they may have even used that same road to travel up to get to Tomlinson Lake, because there's parts of that road where you could still see where that road is still there. It's kind of grown up a little bit, but you could see that it still is there, and it would have existed there in probably like the mid 1800s.
Okay.
As a kid, I always this is gonna sound weird. I always pictured it as like a literal massive cavern that people would just walk across. But like when I got older and more research into the topic, I realized that it's more of a disjointed series of goodwill and fortunate happening upon, right? The right time, the right place, the right person. I find that really interesting. I just think it's really fascinating how this came to be out of the goodwill of people. I hope that can start again someday soon.
And I know with one of my previous talks with Mr. G, we talked about that goodwill. For example, I'm sure that after crossing that border, because there was no border, of course, you saw the lake, so I guess that signified that you're in Canada. After crossing and going into that community, you weren't exactly sure that you were safe. So, and that goes back to the goodwill. You didn't know if somebody's gonna give you to the authorities or not. So I guess it wasn't, and that's why we don't have a lot of proof of African American families staying in the area right after they cross. Is that correct? Because there was that fear of the close proximity to the border.
Yeah, so there's oral history, again, dictates that there were 3 families that had built squatter cabins. They had built homes in Carleton County. And I think one was in Upper Kent, that's in Carleton County. That's like right on the line, isn't it? It's just on the line, but it's within that vicinity. So, but anyways, so there was one family that made a home about 20 minutes downriver by vehicle, like by today's standards, 20 minutes, probably maybe a half a day hike if in 1800s. And then there was another one on Bird Hill which was just outside between Wilmot and Waterville, New Brunswick, which is about 40-minute drive from Tomlinson Lake. And then there was another squatter's home in Jacksontown, New Brunswick, which is just 10 minutes away from Bird Hill. So we do know that there are three squatters' homes. And I say squatters because when they came here, they didn't own land. They were fugitives or refugees. So they just found a plot of land, built a little makeshift home, and was planning probably just to stay there until after, things had settled down in the States. Do you have the book called Black Bangor? So in that book, it talks about blacks who came to New Brunswick via the Underground Railroad, and 75% of those blacks went back to Bangor and later further down eastern Maine and Boston, Massachusetts, different places like that, because that's where the opportunity was for them, and that's where their homes were. A lot of these people were already free blacks who were refugees in those northern states where they were seeking asylum, and then after the Compromise Bill of 1850, that kind of put them on the run again. So they just went further north. They just crossed the line until after the Civil War, and then most of them all came back, because you could think like they still do that today. Refugees, when they go to other countries, after that, after the wars ended in their country and things are going back to normal, they go back to their original homes and try to, rebuild, from where they left off. So
Yeah, because
history repeats itself.
during the Civil War, the most unsegregated, unslave point is term being like in urban places like Boston, New York. Those are the most liberal, the most abolitionist sided, whereas rural areas were the more extremely segregated and slave driven. And it would make sense they would rush to more cities, more urban places where they know they have a chance to live as. Watch what I say here. A chance for freedom.
I think it probably. I was just reading a book recently that was talking about one of the problems, and as Joe just mentioned, not all of them got land. For instance, if we're talking about the loyalists, the black loyalists who came that were promised land, they were promised land, but they only owned it as long as they stayed on it. Whereas the white loyalists, they were granted the land and then they could sell it if they wanted to leave. Whereas the black loyalists only got the land as long as they were occupying it, using it. So it can also be that so that they didn't have the ability to sell off and have capital and go somewhere else. They had to stay there and use it. And some of them lost the land because they didn't realize that, and they left looking for work and came back and sorry, your land's been given away to somebody else now. And I think one of the other problems was 1840s. There was a huge influx of Irish refugees.
Yep.
And every refugees that are coming in, the parish has to pay for helping them out. And so at that point, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia was a little bit mad about all of the money that they were giving out to help the refugees. So they were sort of like, we don't want as many coming in. So there could be some tensions going on as well as that. I know it's a few years later, but you still had that 1847, I think, we'd get all the Irish refugees coming.
Yeah.
So that was sort of that land use, right? And then do we need labor? So I'm going to the idea of the rural. It's not necessarily segregation, but there might not have been land set aside. Whereas if they were in the cities, they could get jobs, sort of
correct, yeah,
jobs, so to speak.
The labor need, yep. Yeah.
And they were willing to work for cheaper. And that caused the problem because that drove the wages down, and that made a lot of loyalists angry. I mean, there was even loyalists in Shelburne that were angry about the cheap labor that blacks were willing to do that lived in Birchtown. They actually, you ever see on the movies where they go with the pitchforks and the torches?
Right.
That actually happened, and they burned down a mill where this guy was harboring these blacks at his mill, and he had them hired. They went and burned his mill down. So you had a lot of that. So when a lot of people there was a lot of racism, and a lot of people have this this common misconception that they came to Canada to be free because Canadians were more accepting, and there was more equality here, but it was actually just it was the same here as it was anywhere else. There was not really equality. And when you are a black fugitive and you come to Canada, you're just the only thing you're doing is escaping being caught by a bounty hunter. You still had all those same dangers are still present up and down through the St. John River Valley that existed in Pennsylvania or New York or even in southern states. So there was a lot of people who didn't agree with it, just like there is today. You have people who are pro-immigration of refugees, and you have people who don't think that refugees belong here. So again, history repeats itself.
That's very true, and we do, as you said, we do have the misconception all the time that they go to Canada because Canadians are better than they're more kind than Americans. But of course, it's not true. It's
well, they kind of are, but
yeah.
But we're talking back in the 1800s.
Yeah, which again,
I'm just joking by.
Canadians.
Yeah, I'm just joking by. I'm a dual citizen actually, and I
So
think
much.
yeah, and she is too. So
we believe you. No
so
worries on that.
Awesome.
I think it is that tension. As long as, I mean, there were the benevolent people giving money, whether it's to the Irish or to the Black refugees. But then all of a sudden, when there's a lot more coming in, your benevolence doesn't stretch quite as far. And so you go, wait a minute, how do we keep? And there were plenty of stories actually of raising money for over there, like stay over there, rather than the ones right here.
True.
That were,
And
right under the nose.
and I know there was some research done about talking about how these refugees will go and hopefully find black settlements, black towns that they will go and settle in. So it is really interesting to see those connections between their underground railroad all the way southern Maine and northern Maine, hopefully, and then they cross to the New Brunswick, and then you have a cycle of events coming back to the urban cities and having all those things happening at that period.
Can I
Oh, yeah,
jump in on this one too, Evan?
sure, yeah.
Well, one of the things is that so the Black Loyalists arrive in what, 1783. So they're well established by the time you've got the refugees coming from around 50. Well, then you had the second round in 1812, right?
yeah, so there's so we refer to those as different influxes. So the 1783 we refer to those as the black loyalists.
Yeah.
Then in 1812 we have the refugees. So in the southern part of New Brunswick, see, in 1783, New Brunswick was still considered Nova Scotia. It was all one. So when they brought the Black Loyalists came to Nova Scotia, that also means New Brunswick as well. So they also established their own little town near St. Andrews. They referred to that as Slab Town. That is directly across the bay, directly across the bay from Robinson, Maine. Where did you touch on that one? That safe house in Robinson, Maine?
I don't think we've had. No.
I don't know.
No. So it's today I think it's like a bed and breakfast.
Yeah, I think
But that was actually a safe house for the Underground Railroad, and it was right directly across from that black community, which is now under the number 2 hole of the Algonquin Golf Course. So in St. Andrews. So what they would do is when it was dark, they would put them on a boat and they would paddle across the bay. And where did they end up on the other side? In this little black community. So I think a lot of the black fugitives that who are or the fugitive slaves coming from northern Maine or even southern Maine between 1840 and 1865, they were either building a little house out in the middle of nowheres and just want to be left alone, or they were traveling to go into places where there were already black communities established, where not only where they might fit in better, but although there are some people who dispute that, because they say that black loyalists were prejudiced against the fugitive slaves. Yeah,
That's interesting.
But they would also kind of
established.
They would blend in.
Yeah.
So visibly blend in, but there's a little class, right? So they see themselves, the Black Loyalists have been there a long time, well established, were associated with the British, and then here come the fugitives that they.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Want to be associated in some.
Yeah. See, I didn't even think about it when I talk about going back to if somebody that you're familiar with. So I didn't even think about that, and I don't think the majority of people that talk or think about, or the teachers today in schools that teach to our future generations about the Underground Railroad, that to begin with they only give about an hour of their high school or what middle school is to cover the full events. They really don't talk about these connections.
Yeah, no, what I was being taught was basically Harriet Tubman. It existed. That's it.
Which is
There's a good movie coming out December
Yeah,
1st.
you see that.
yeah,
Yeah.
it is coming out. It's the story of Harriet Tubman, I believe, right? Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, like they never give it the justice it deserves because there's so much history with just this one event.
Yeah.
Series of events.
At this point, we would like to thank WUPI for hosting our podcast, and we wanted to let you know that WUPI is now available online, but also on the TuneIn app. So make sure you click that subscribe button and listen to Ampi's and Presque Isle's #1 hit music station. Also, if you want to keep up with WUPI's and Ampi's events and news, make sure to like their pages on social media, and to find more about our podcast series and listen to any of our previous or future podcasts, make sure to follow our pages on SoundCloud and YouTube by simply searching History Hour Podcast, and make sure you give us some thumbs up.
You know,
This one.
All right, and we are right back. And we gave, I think, a fair description. Of course, short enough. This is only one episode of our podcast.
It's the amount of time you said before, an hour.
Exactly. So, Dr. Allen and Mr. G, why do you think it is important to know about all of this today? And what does it add to the cultural and overall historical identity of both your area, but also the larger vicinity of what we call Northern Maine?
And another question, do you think that school should focus more on the railroad than the war itself, or should it be an equal amount of sharing? Like an equal time, rather.
Okay, so one of the things that flashed through my head is a friend in graduate school. I guess we just graduated. Anyway, she came up and we were in Grand Falls. I was playing my bagpipes in the parade, and she looked around. She said, "That's kind of interesting, but I never live here because there's no diversity. How can you bring up a kid?" And I thought, well, there is a lot of diversity here. You might not see it at first. And so I think part of that, well, so I guess on the one hand is like, I think uncovering this past that maybe isn't as visible now, that, you know, the landscape has changed a lot, the demographics has changed, and realizing, you know, that this small part of the world is part of a much bigger migration, population, politics that was going on. And then I think that, you know, to bring me to the second reason, you know, just in that conversation we had about the you know, tensions around immigrants coming in. If we don't think of it just as, you know, if we just think of the term immigrant itself, that's a recurring problem, you know, or tension or debate that's up right now. So I think looking at history allows you to kind of learn from some of the lessons, I guess, or things that never got resolved, and we're still trying to work at them, maybe with a different population, but we still have some of the same, you know, economic tensions, religious tensions, racial tensions, you know, different groups trying to work out. So I think part of that is important to know, right? And I think there is still obviously racism present. So I think part of this is trying to recognize the centrality of a group of people who have been marginalized.
What about the history? Do you think this is really important to add to the future history books written about this area?
Yeah, like for instance, here in New Brunswick, there's not much in the curriculum for school kids to learn about a lot of local history or even significant history that has happened. It's kind of biased and whitewashed, for a better term. And so to teach this history in school about the Underground Railroad or the different migrations of different cultures, it's important because we need to preserve history, and the only way to preserve history is by teaching it and sharing it. if you stop sharing, if you stop teaching a particular type of history, then it's no longer preserved. And so this type of history is just as important to preserve it as any other history that is already being taught or it's already part of a school curriculum.
Completely. That's the
The
reason.
other thing about teaching history, I think it's kind of like the same point you're making, is if we want to better understand who we are, or better understand, what makes up our communities, or why do we have the things we have today? Why do we have certain laws that exist today? Then we need to understand. We need to understand history. I run into a lot of people up my way who have a lot of thinking errors. One example is the past is the past. Let's just move on. That is a horrible thinking error, and it makes, I don't know, makes my blood boil when I hear people use that, because all that is a logical fallacy. They're creating a straw man. So basically, they're saying by focusing on this bad thing that happened. Of course, there's a lot of history that's uncomfortable to a lot of people, but it's only uncomfortable if we internalize it. So again, all that is a logical fallacy. There's another thing that I run into is why are we teaching that? Because there's no blacks around here, and that's how you get that all the time. But actually, this whole river valley, I'm the vice president of the Black History Society here in New Brunswick, and one of our project coordinators, Ralph Thomas, he has a map, and on that map, every little place where we've touched, where our organization has touched, where we've found history of blacks who lived in New Brunswick, we put a dot on that map. This whole river valley is full of invisible dots. They're there. We just don't know the stories yet. And every year there's more and more information that pops up, whether it be an unmarked graves of blacks who are buried, just 30 minutes from here, or a story about a black woman who was murdered in the early 1900s in Plastrop. Somebody drowned her in the Tobic River. Or
what about the first black lawyer? I just learned about that.
The first black lawyer. So Peter Little conducted a lot of work on what is his name? Abraham. So there's all that history exists, and if we try to make up excuses like, well, there's no blacks here, or why do we need to learn that, then what's going to happen? It's not going to be preserved.
Absolutely. And
because you have to remember, can I just say about history is often told from
the victor,
the victor's point of view.
The victor writes the
I think it's part of that.
History is written by the victor.
Absolutely, and I see it personally, and I guess it was a part of creating this episode as it's something that the majority of people don't know, and the majority of historians, you'll be surprised, don't know, or sometimes they don't want to know. That's a different aspect of it, but also it is part of the identity, I guess, of this area, and it's really important to be recognized and be official, and in the greater scheme of things, being an attraction, maybe to commemorate that and make it part of Northern Maine. So it is really important. And Kaleb, you had something to say, I think, before about education.
I was just wondering do you guys think that it's no secret that in today's schools, events like this are kind of shorthanded? Like, hey, the Underground Railroad was this really cool thing. It helped slaves escape. That's about it. Do you think that it should be taught more, in general, about certain areas, or they should stick to the areas they're in? Like, should a school in California teach about stops in Maine, or should it be across the board? Like one standard across the board.
So you're asking about, so the education be sort of regional? So what's happening in your area? Or
Should it be like what happened the whole thing?
And maybe Maine policy too. Maine education, because it is about Maine and New Brunswick, of course. Maine and New Brunswick, because these are the two areas that we're focusing about now, the last route. So I think on that aspect, yeah.
Well, that's where heritage fairs come into play. I don't know if that happens in the school curriculum in Maine or in the States, but here in New Brunswick, we have science fairs. We also have heritage fairs. And those heritage fairs give students an opportunity to focus on local history. And in the last 7 years since we've started organizing this annual hike to freedom, I get asked to go be a judge at heritage fairs, and I see, like, every time I go, I see three, four kids who chosen the topic, the Underground Railroad that came to New Brunswick. And they're all sharing that information. So this year we actually had a group of homeschoolers who were given an opportunity to be involved in a heritage fair that was put on by UMB, and there was two young students who chose the Underground Railroad that came from Fringe Church to Tomlinson Lake, and these girls lived in Fredericton, which was like 2.5 hours away, and so they chose the Underground Railroad, and their parents brought them to the hiking event this fall. So they educated themselves about the Underground Railroad. So here we have these students in Fredericton, New Brunswick, who researched and educated themselves about the Underground Railroad that came to Fringe Church in Fort Fairfield and to Tomlinson Lake. And then they created a project where they taught other students and other spectators who came to the Heritage Fair about that history. And then in the end, they all came and they experienced that for themselves at our annual hiking event. So, it's taken off.
And I like seeing that.
I guess that's where it differs from the actual curriculum of history being taught in school.
Yeah.
Whereas if those more finer details of that local history, where those children are given an opportunity to use that in a heritage fair. So I don't know if students, if they do that and they do that over there, heritage fairs.
I don't know much about the K-12 system.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
And I mean, in the other part, I do like seeing that, the community embracing this, their history, to be honest. It is their history, it is their past, they live in that area. So especially what you just said, young kids getting involved in this, I think it's going to really increase the historical involvement in the future.
And I think also, you can use a project about the local, like, so if it was, as Kaleb's suggesting, should it be regional, right? So should your history, in a sense, be regional? But I think it's also an opportunity to connect outwards. You see this whole network of how things are interconnected. And I think, to me, that's the most important thing to learn, is that every decision, an event that happens is always connected to something else. It's always really complicated, right? And so that's, as soon as you start unraveling, you'll see all the strands and it becomes a global network. So I think, you could start small in your local backyard, but as soon as you start, okay, so who's connected to who, where are they landing, you end up with a much bigger picture.
It's going to expand, yeah, if you're starting
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right, you keep on uncovering these questions. Okay, I need to know about this, and I need to know about that, and that's connected to this, right? So you work backwards in terms of, you end up with this whole big map.
And then it hopefully gets integrated into the greater scholarly work when it comes to the Underground Railroad all the way from the south, and it gets incorporated to all of those aspects that we just talked about today. So we got one more question for you. Is there anything planned, and you guys can take your turns, for the future that will touch upon this topic even further and continue from the previous work and build up? I guess we'll start with Dr. Allen.
Are you asking about the honors program? How that?
I know that as the director of the honors program, you have those materials. What will happen in the future? And I guess with Mr. G, what will happen? What's happening? I guess, and what will happen in the future with all the initiatives that you are working with, the Freedom Hike and stuff like that.
Okay, so if I go first, one of the things I'd like is to have all of the documentation collected somehow in a place. I think we reached out to a lot of different people. We've gotten a lot of sort of hand notes or audio interviews, and I would like to have that kind of archived, collected somehow, so that if anybody else wants to do the project, they don't start all over from the bottom again. You could sort of start with some of the material. One of the other things, I really like those maps. You're talking about the pinpoints, and I think if each one of those pinpoints could open up some sort of document that, okay, here are all the references that we have to prove this. Here's the oral history. Here's some images. I think that would be a really, people can take kind of a virtual tour, and some of that imagery would be. So for me, part of it is coming up with the technology, how to store, document, but also disseminate that information so it doesn't sit in a folder in my file.
So we're going to continue to promote this important bit of local history, and that can that has a lot of different ways of doing what we're doing right now.
I guess keep making connections, right? Keep gathering stories.
That's what it does. Yeah. We're going to promote this bit of history, and we're going to give people that bit of experience that they can get by coming to our annual hiking event. And in doing so, you never know. We might always get, if people know that we're doing that, then people will come to us. Maybe someone will have a little bit of information about something. Oh, hey, did you know that so-and-so tore down a house and they found this? So if people know that you're doing it, then people are going to come forth with information that might be a missing piece to that of a puzzle.
Yeah. So you think it's going in the right direction?
Oh, definitely.
That's good to hear, I guess. Yes. And we do want to hear that in the future as well and see it expand. So that was our last question. Is there anything last you guys want to add on before we conclude this episode?
I like to say, I'd like to thank all the people who were generous with the information and shared it. I think the ropers were very generous, especially helping us, and everybody else. I think it definitely takes a lot of different people to who are willing to give some time and share their knowledge, and I think that's the best way it happens.
Great. Kaleb, any last thoughts?
Thank you for being here. This was very, very enlightening. I had no idea Maine had such a rich history. As far as I knew, it was bears, trees, and snow. I really did enjoy hearing about all this. Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you for being with us.
You're welcome. Thanks.
All right, thanks.
So thank you for listening to the History Hour. Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on YouTube or SoundCloud. Then stay tuned for next week when we talk about why we celebrate Veterans Day. Thank you, and until next time.
See ya.